By the early 21st century, Egyptologists had largely agreed with Howard Carter's belief that Tutankhamun was biologically linked to his immediate royal predecessors, making him the last ruler of Egypt's 18th dynasty in the direct line of succession that began with Thutmose I. To this day, no genetic connection has been established between Thutmose I and Ahmose, the founder of the New Kingdom who defeated Khmuni, ending the 15th dynasty of foreign rulers from the Levant who had governed Egypt for about a century. From around 1480 BC, when Thutmose II followed Thutmose I on the throne, kingship generally passed from father to child, sometimes daughter, as in the case of Queen Hatshepsut, through to the reign of Amenhotep IV. He was one of the children born to Amenhotep III and his principal wife, Tai. However, the precise family ties between Amenhotep, the fourth better, known as Akhenaten, after he changed his name to honor the sun god, Aten, his successors remain hotly debated, despite recent analyses of royal mummies by teams of scientists, radiologists, and pathologists. The question remains unresolved. One group argues that Akhenaten was the father of Prince Tutankhamun, while another leans towards Smenkhkare, whose identity and status also remain uncertain. Was he Akhenaten's son, his brother, a co-regent, or a successor? The identity of Tutankhamun's mother is also still under dispute, with experts divided on the matter. A key piece of evidence in the debate over Tutankhamun's parentage is the so-called Hermopolis block, composed of two joined fragments decorated on both sides. It was discovered in the 1930s by a German team from Hildesheim during excavations at Ashmuni, ancient Hermopolis. It is one of hundreds of blocks originally from Akhenaten's buildings at Tel El Amarna, the capital city he established across the Nile. During the reign of Horemheb Tutankhamun's second successor, these structures were dismantled and their blocks reused in Hermopolis. Later, during the reign of Ramesses II, even Horemheb's constructions were taken apart and the blocks were recycled again, this time to build a temple gateway. The reliefs and inscriptions on these blocks from Tel El Amarna suffered both intentional and accidental damage at various stages in their history. By the time the German expedition recovered the relevant block, it had been broken in half and the pieces separated. Scholars studying Tutankhamun's lineage initially overlooked that the excavator had identified the two pieces as belonging together. In 1997, Jacobus van Dyck brought attention back to this block by publishing a drawing of the inscription, followed a few years later by Mark Gabold's version. Both Egyptologists based their work on photos from the excavation report, as the physical fragments had gone missing. In 2008, Zahi Hawass, then chairman of Egypt's Supreme Council of Antiquities, announced in his column Dig Days that the block had been rediscovered in a storage facility at Ashmuni. In 2013, he included a striking photo of the inscribed side of the block in his seventh book on Tutankhamun. W. Raymond Johnson later reconstructed the decorative design on the reverse side of the block, which featured a column capital adorned with garlands, including ducks hanging upside down. In non-royal tombs at Amarna, columns decorated in this way often supported pavilions where the royal family appeared. Still, it is the other side of the block, with 6 vertical columns of inscription, that holds the most interest for Egyptologists. The text is arranged symmetrically, but not perfectly centered, with more of the right-hand third column preserved than the left. The inscription on the right reads, "Kings, son of his body, whom he loves, Tutankhamun." The final, partially preserved hieroglyph, a squatting male figure, confirms the individual is male. This is the only known mention of the name Tutankhamun, either as a prince or king, that can be definitively linked to Tel El Amarna. The text on the left starts similarly with king's daughter of his body, continuing with whom he loves, one greatly favored by the Lord of the Two Lands, referring to the king. Unfortunately, the girl's name is missing. Apart from a reed leaf symbol at the bottom of the final column, representing the word Aten, Van Dyck and Gaboldi both follow the interpretation of the German excavator, who concluded that the princess mentioned in the text is Ankhesenet, the third eldest daughter of Akhenaten and Nefertiti. However, it raises the question: the girl possibly be one of their other daughters, whose names also include the sun god Aten. For example, in the name of the second eldest daughter, Akhenaten, the element Aten appears at the end in roughly a third of the known instances. Yet she likely passed away before the inscription mentioning Prince Tutankhamun was created. The fourth daughter, Nefertiti Jr., is rarely mentioned in records, and her name like that of the eldest daughter. Merentin consistently begins with the Aten component. The only daughter whose name regularly ends with Aten is Akhenaten, making her the most probable candidate for the princess in the inscription. Gaboldi argues that the Hermopolis block proves Prince Tutankhamun shared both parents with at least one sister. He identifies these parents as Akhenaten and Nefertiti, suggesting that children born to different wives were not shown together in official royal imagery. While this pattern does seem to hold up with the limited evidence from Tel El Amarna, Gaboldi himself has supported an exception to this rule. In the tomb of Huya, the steward of Queen Tai, there are two scenes depicting Akhenaten and Nefertiti with two daughters seated opposite Tai, who is accompanied by a princess named Akhenaten. Some Egyptologists, including the author of this analysis, accept the identification proposed over a century ago by Norman de Garris Davies, who considered Akhenaten to be the daughter of Amenhotep III and Queen Tai, therefore Akhenaten's sister. However, Gaboldi identifies her instead as the daughter of Kiya, a lesser-known wife of Akhenaten. There are reliefs showing this unnamed daughter with Kiya, confirming her existence, though her name remains unknown. If Gaboldi's reading of the Huya tomb scene is accepted, it undermines his own interpretation of the Hermopolis block. In that case, Tutankhamun could very well be the son of Akhenaten by another consort besides Nefertiti. According to the traditional understanding of the Huya tomb imagery, the king referred to in Akhenaten's title, King's Daughter, is not the same king referenced in the titles of the princesses shown with Akhenaten and Nefertiti's as the king in Nefertiti's title. Great Royal Wife is not the same as the king named in Tai's title. The absence of Tutankhamun from the many depictions of Akhenaten and Nefertiti with their daughters is not strong evidence against the idea that Nefertiti was his mother. Supporters of this theory rightly note that royal depictions at Tel El Amarna typically follow a long-standing tradition of excluding male children, a convention that continued into the 19th dynasty. Still, Gaboldi maintains that Tutankhamun does appear in one such scene specifically, in a relief in Akhenaten's tomb in the royal wadi at Amarna, where a woman is shown holding a baby. These scenes appear on the walls of two chambers and gamma located in a three-room annex, branching off the stairway leading to the tomb's main pillared hall, where Akhenaten was buried. There are three such scenes in total, two in chamber. Al-Fu showing Akhenaten and Nefertiti mourning over a deceased woman lying on a bed. In two of these, a woman and a child are positioned just outside the room, facing away from the scene. In ancient times, only the scene in chamber gamma had an inscription identifying the figures. But even more of that text has been lost since it was first copied by a French Egyptologist in the late 19th century. Experts continue to debate who the damaged inscription referred to. Was it naming the woman or the baby? Their identities remain uncertain, as does the gender of the infant. The notion that the infant depicted as Tutankhamun was not originally introduced by Gaboldi. Earlier scholars had suggested that the child might be Princess Akhenaten, identified by inscription as the woman whose death is mourned by Akhenaten, and Nefertiti, in Chamber Gamor, possibly Kiya, who has been proposed as the unnamed deceased woman in Chamber Alpha. Nefertiti was not considered a candidate for the mother in these earlier theories. Van D. J. K. dismisses these interpretations, instead proposing that the child held by the nurse represents Akhenaten herself, reborn in the afterlife. However, this idea has been convincingly refuted by Geoffrey T. Martin van Dyck also puts forward the suggestion that the placement of the prince and princess's names on the Hermopolis block implies that the two were already married at the time the inscriptions were created. The princess is described with the title "greatly favored by the Lord of the Two Lands," which could indicate her elevated status. This particular epithet is not found elsewhere on the Hermopolis blocks, making it a unique instance. Only two other women of the 18th dynasty are known to have borne similar titles. Sataman, Akhenaten's sister, was described as favored, but not greatly favored by the Lord of the Two Lands, her father, Amenhotep III, the royal wet nurse of Nefertiti, and later, the wife of I. Tutankhamun's successor was called greatly favored by Wenra, another name for Akhenaten, as Tutankhamun's wife, Ankhesenpoten, was referred to as Great of Favors, and she kept this honorific even after changing her name to Ankhesenaten, epithet also associated with her grandmother Tai, who had held it as the chief wife of Amenhotep III. When Ankhesenaten and Tutankhamun were married remains uncertain. It may have occurred only after his accession to the throne, possibly as a means of ensuring the continued status of Akhenaten and Nefertiti's daughter during the period of political and religious restoration, rather than to reinforce his legitimacy as king, as has often been suggested. In truth, little is known about royal marriages in ancient Egypt beyond diplomatic unions that involved gift exchanges. Among commoners, marriages appear not to have required any formal ceremony or ritual. A woman's title as wife indicated her marital status, but how and when that title was acquired remains unclear. Regarding the identity of Tutankhamun's parents, Van Dyck dismisses the possibility that Amenhotep III and Queen Akhenaten's own parents were his actual progenitors, as some had previously speculated. He also rules out Nefertiti as his mother, noting that the monuments credit her exclusively with daughters. Kiya, Akhenaten's only other named and depicted wife, is shown at times accompanied by a daughter, but never a son. Despite using this evidence to argue against Nefertiti's maternity, Van Dyck is hesitant to completely reject the idea that Kiya might have had a son. He speculates that Kiya's disappearance from the historical record may have coincided with the birth of Tutankhamun, whose arrival as a potential heir could have posed a threat to Nefertiti's standing. Aidan Dodson, who considers Van Dyck's interpretation of the royal tomb scene worth exploring, nonetheless maintains his own belief that Akhenaten and Nefertiti were Tutankhamun's parents. Dodson interprets the inscriptions on the Hermopolis block as captions identifying figures of Ankhesenaten and Tutankhamun in a dual scene, in which Akhenaten and Nefertiti are shown worshipping the Aten with their children. The scene split, so that each parent stands with some of the children. It is likely that the names of the prince and princess on the block were meant to label specific figures. However, the arrangement of the hieroglyphic columns which face one another makes it difficult to support Dodson's interpretation. In typical Amarna scenes depicting the royal family worshipping the sun, Disk Aten, Akhenaten, and Nefertiti do not face each other, as Dodson's reading would require. Instead, the daughters are shown following behind their mother, who herself stands behind Akhenaten, James. P. Allen's interpretation of the original context for the Hermopolis block remains somewhat unclear. He suggests that the prince and princess were depicted in a composition, showing some kind of close or personal interaction, hinting at a strong association between them, perhaps even a marriage prior to Tutankhamun's rise to the throne. The presence of large-scale depictions of Akhenaten and his family in temple reliefs and palace murals at Amarna is confirmed by other blocks discovered at Hermopolis. Two of these, one located in Brooklyn and the other in Cairo, show Nefertiti kissing a princess. In scenes like those on family stelae and within non-royal tombs at Amarna, the positioning of the children's bodies, rather than the direction of their heads, usually determines the orientation of the inscriptions identifying them. If the same rule applies to the Hermopolis block, it would suggest that the prince and princess were shown facing each other, even if their heads were turned toward a parent. The size of the hieroglyphs implies that the figures they identified were rendered on a relatively large scale. Many texts from Amarna that name the daughters of Akhenaten and Nefertiti end with the phrase, "born of the king's great wife, Nefertiti. May she live forever." If the inscriptions on the Hermopolis block followed this formula, it would have created a visual and spatial gap between the figures. No matter how they were positioned in the composition, it is also possible that the prince and princess were shown without any parents or siblings, standing face to face. As appears multiple times in the artwork on the small golden shrine from Tutankhamun's tomb object No. 108, however, that shrine was created after Tutankhamun's accession, and after both he and his queen had changed their names to include the god Amen. Ultimately, the only firm conclusion that can be drawn from the Hermopolis block is that both the prince and princess were children of a king, but not necessarily the same king. Between September 2007 and October 2009, a team of Egyptian and German researchers led by Zahi Hawass conducted CT scans and extracted DNA from several mummies. One of the goals was to use modern scientific methods to clarify familial relationships within Akhenaten's lineage. The team also aimed to determine the cause of Tutankhamun's death. The results of their findings were announced in a press release issued by the Supreme Council of Antiquities on February 17, 2010, and were simultaneously published in the Journal of the American Medical Association. However, criticism soon followed. Dennis Forbes, editor of KMT, a modern journal of ancient Egypt, was among the first non-medical commentators to voice skepticism. He pointed out inconsistencies between the press release and the published journal article, highlighting how the former presented confident conclusions, while the latter employed much more cautious language though both affirmed that Akhenaten was likely Tutankhamun's father. Before evaluating these findings further, it is important to acknowledge that recent studies have raised broader concerns about the reliability of DNA testing, even in modern forensic science. That said, the analyses conducted by Howiss's team reportedly indicated that Tutankhamun was the son of the man buried in tomb KV-55, a modest, single-chambered tomb located near Tutankhamun's own tomb KV-62. This man was also identified as a son of the elder lady, a mummy believed to be Queen Ty. That identification was supported by earlier discoveries in KV-46, which contained the mummies of Ty's parents. Ty herself, along with a mummy labeled as Amenhotep III, had been found in 1898 by Victor Lorette in the tomb of Amenhotep, to KV-35. Could Amenhotep III and Ty have had 3 sons, and both an older and a younger brother, such as the well-documented Prince Thutmose? The ownership of the KV-55 coffin and the identity of the mummy inside remain major points of debate. Among Amarna period scholars, the anthropoid coffin in question features a figure wearing the so-called Nubianor pointed wig, made up of layered, tightly curled ringlets. Whether the uraeus, the royal serpent emblem, and the braided divine beard at the chin were original to the coffin or later additions is still under discussion. The coffin's inlaid feather-like decoration matches royal New Kingdom standards. Similar to the outer coffin of Queen Nefertiti, mother of Amenhotep, the arms are crossed over the chest pose found in coffins of both men and women. When KV-55 was excavated, the items once held in the mummy's hands were missing. These may have been the traditional crook and flail of pharaohs, ankh symbols, or even papyrus scepters, depending on the individual's status and gender. Around 15 years ago, Alfred Grimm proposed that the coffin was originally crafted for Akhenaten early in his rule. Since it was no longer suitable for use, it was instead repurposed for his successor Smenkhkare. Prior to Grimm's theory, the widely accepted view among scholars was that the coffin-like, the canopic jars found in the same tomb, had been made for Akhenaten's other wife, Kiya, and later modified for Akhenaten himself. However, Grimm's explanation for the coffin's design as fitting for Akhenaten does not hold up under closer scrutiny. The Nubian-style wig featured on the coffin also incorporated into the design of the canopic jar lids is strongly linked with only one individual during the Amarna period, Kiya. Although there are a few depictions of Akhenaten wearing this type of wig, they are not comparable to royal burial imagery and do not date from the early years of his reign, which Grimm suggests is when the coffin was produced. Moreover, Grimm seems to have misinterpreted the modifications made to the inscriptions, which are similar to those seen on the small canopic coffinets that were adapted for Tutankhamun from items originally made for a reigning queen who preceded him. The original owner of the coffin was identified in the inlaid hieroglyphic strips on the front of the lid and the upper edge of the basin. These were entirely replaced with new strips naming Akhenaten, while a separate inscription crafted using the chasing technique on the gold sheeting under the foot of the coffin was altered through patchwork. These modifications likely occurred when a decision was made to relocate Akhenaten's remains from the royal tomb at Amarna to the Valley of the Kings in western Thebes. The careful manner in which Akhenaten's cartouches were later removed indicates an intent to substitute his name with that of another individual, rather than to simply erase it. Notably, Akhenaten's titles such as Perfect Little Child, of Atan, and Great in his lifetime were left intact, suggesting that these phrases were deemed appropriate for the new owner. Similarly, the title Perfect Ruler that begins the text down the coffin's lid a phrase introduced by Akhenaten to replace the older term perfect god around the 12th year of his reign, continued to be used for some time after Tutankhamun took the throne. Yet even if the debate over the coffin's original ownership were finally resolved, the identity of the person actually buried in it would still be open to question, especially since the inscriptions were in the process of being altered to reflect a new occupant before the Egyptian German team released their findings. Some Egyptologists believed the coffin was deposited in KV 55 by people who thought they were interring Akhenaten. Others were convinced the remains were indeed his, while some suggested they belonged to his male successor, or corregent, Smenkhare, possibly his son or brother. The results of the Egyptian German team's analysis of the KV 55 remains have not resolved the issue, partly because internal disagreements among team members came to light during a televised documentary covering the project. To date, the evidence supporting their claim that the individual died between the ages of 35 and 45 has not been published. The JAMA article merely states, the mummy in KV 55 was previously thought to have died in his 20s. However, our new CT scans show that he lived significantly longer. If accurate, the estimated age range of 35 to 45 years suggests that Akhenaten would have been between 18 and 28 when he became king, a plausible time frame, considering the major events of his 17-year reign and the birth of his children, including his likely son Tutankhamun. Still, this estimate is higher than those proposed by earlier experts. In 1992, the highest previous estimate was 30 to 35 years old, based on a revaluation by Professor James E. Harris and Professor Falzia H. Hussein. Yet, like the findings cited in the JAMA article, that data was never formally published or made available for scholarly review. Other researchers who studied the KV 55 remains, starting with G. Elliott Smith in the early 1900s and continuing through the year 2000, suggested the individual was between 18 and 25 years old at death. This estimate is difficult, if not impossible, to align with the dramatic reforms and religious changes that characterize the first 5 years of Akhenaten's reign, a point that has been previously emphasized by scholars. Shortly after the JAMA article was published, Eugene Strohol released the findings of his 1998 analysis of the remains from KV 55. He concluded that the male individual died at an age between 19 and 22 years, a result that aligns with R.G. Harrison's earlier assessment from nearly 45 years prior. Corinne Duhigg, a physical anthropologist, supported Strohol's estimate in an accompanying article. While Duhigg refrains from identifying the individual, Strohol confidently asserts that the remains belong to Smenkhare, Tutankhamun's elder brother. However, none of these scholars directly confront the fundamental challenge of aging ancient remains, the lack of precisely dated comparative samples. Dodson has drawn attention to this issue, highlighting the significant disparities between age-at-death estimates made by physical anthropologists and the actual ages recorded on coffins in the 18th and 19th century crypts of Christchurch, Spitalfields, London. These examples illustrate how the age of older individuals is often underestimated, while that of younger individuals tends to be overestimated. According to the Egyptian German team, the mummy known as the Younger Lady, found in the tomb of Amenhotep II alongside the remains of Amenhotep III and the Elder Lady, was both the mother of Prince Tutankhamun and the sister of the man buried in KV 55. Based on this, she must have been a daughter of Amenhotep III and Queen Tai. However, Hawass and his colleagues stopped short of identifying her as any of their known daughters. This raises the question, could Nefertiti, currently favored by both Dodson and Gaboldi as Tutankhamun's mother, be a plausible candidate for the younger lady's identity? While the names of Nefertiti's sister and nurse are known, her parents remain unnamed in the records, contrast to the frequent references to Queen Tai's lineage, but rather than being unusual, this silence appears typical for the period. With Tai's case being the exception, it is conceivable that one of Amenhotep III's daughters assumed the name Nefertiti upon marrying Akhenaten. Yet if Nefertiti truly were the daughter of Amenhotep III, and thus Akhenaten's sister, it is striking that her titles never included king's daughter or king's sister, despite the wealth of documentation about her. Using DNA data reported by Hawass's team, both the Swiss Egyptologist Hermann Schlegel and Mark Gaboldi have have proposed alternative versions of Tutankhamun's family tree. Working with a genetics expert and a biotechnician, Shailgel first identifies the mummy found in the tomb of Amenhotep, to which was labeled by an ancient scribe as Amenhotep III. During a restoration around 1060 BC's, actually being King I, Tutankhamun's successor. Following Joanne Fletcher's earlier suggestion, he also identifies the younger lady from the same tomb, now confirmed through DNA to be the daughter of the man Shailgel believes is I, as Nefertiti, G. Elliott Smith. The first scholar to examine the younger lady's mummy soon after its discovery judged the damage to her face and chest to have occurred post-mortem. This view held until Howiss's team re-evaluated the evidence. Shailgel accepts their conclusion that the head injuries were fatal, attributing them to a catastrophic chariot accident involving Nefertiti around the 14th year of Akhenaten's reign, a tragedy that, according to his interpretation, threw Egypt into a deep mourning. However, this theory ignores the evidence suggesting that Nefertiti was still alive during Akhenaten's 16th regnal year. Regarding the elder lady's mummy from KV 35, Shailgel disputes the identification put forth by Howiss's team. He instead argues that she was a woman named Tamwaji, whose name and a single title appear on an inscribed vessel found in the tomb of Queen Ti's parents. In Schlegel's reconstruction, she was another daughter of that couple, and therefore Ti's sister. To be the wife of I, and the mother of the younger lady, identified as Nefertiti, Tamwaji would have had to adopt the name T, matching the name of A's wife, depicted in both his earlier non-royal tomb at Amarna and his royal tomb, KV. I and the elder lady, his supposed wife, were the parents of the individual buried in KV 55. Thus, in his view, the body could not be Akhenaten, the Egyptian German team contends, but must instead be their son, Smenkhare. Schlegel suggests that Smenkhare's marriage to Mertaten, Akhenaten's eldest daughter, provided the legitimacy for his brief rule. In Schlegel's reconstruction, the mummy of Akhenaten, who would be Tutankhamun's father, has not been identified, or at least is not among the individuals examined by Howiss's team. Despite his efforts, Schlegel's proposed genealogy and interpretation of events in the final years of Akhenaten's reign remain unconvincing. In contrast, Marx Gabold's interpretation of the DNA markers presents a compelling case worth considering. He begins by offering strong support for identifying the king's mummy found in KV 35 as Amenhotep III and argues convincingly that the elder lady is indeed Queen Ti. Highlighting an oversight by Howiss's team, Gaboldi points out their failure to recognize genetic similarities between the mummy of Amenhotep III and Ti's father, suggesting that the king and his queen were in fact cousins. Combining archaeological evidence with DNA analysis, Gaboldi proposes that the female mummy, known as KV2, one initially suggested by Howiss's team to be Ankhesenamun, might instead be Mutamira, a wife of Thutmose IV and mother of Amenhotep III. Additionally, Gaboldi remains unconvinced by the claim that the younger lady is Akhenaten's full sister. He contends she could just as likely be a cousin, possibly even Nefertiti, given the prevalence of intrafamilial marriages in the royal family of the late 18th dynasty and the pattern of endogamy observed among the so-called Akhmim clan. Still, the age of the KV 55 mummy remains problematic. Gaboldi argues that an age range of 27 to 30 years is reasonable, which would place Akhenaten at roughly 10 years old when he came to the throne. An idea that seems implausible. Regarding Tutankhamun's mother, her complete absence from the historical record is striking, especially considering how young he was when he ascended the throne. This stands in stark contrast to other queen mothers of the late 18th dynasty, who played prominent roles during their sons' reigns, such as Kiya during the rule of Thutmose IV, Mutemwiya under Amenhotep III, and Ti during Akhenaten's time. No statue, relief, or inscription has been found to honor the woman who gave birth to Tutankhamun, nor is her name mentioned in any of the objects from his tomb. It seems probable that she had passed away before he became king. The theory that Tutankhamun was born at Tel El Amarna and spent his early years there under the care of a wet nurse and tutor is plausible, but so far, no direct evidence supports this idea. The only tangible reference is an inscription on a block from Hermopolis, showing he was included in scenes of the royal family at Akhenaten's capital. This may explain why Gaboldi identifies a smaller male figure sitting on the lap of a larger, also male individual. In another reused block from Tel El Amarna as Tutankhamun, more depictions or inscriptions referencing the young prince may still emerge, whether through excavation or analysis of archival photos. However, current claims of further evidence cannot yet be verified. One such example is a relief fragment of unknown origin, now housed in a private Swiss collection, which allegedly references a sunshade belonging to Prince Tutankhamun's son. Shades were shrines for solar worship, typically set within gardens and shallow pools enclosed in sacred precincts, areas associated exclusively with royal women at Tel El Amarna. Yet the hieroglyphs on the privately owned relief have been misread, and questions about the authenticity of the piece are well-founded. Another claim, made by Lila Pinchbrock, identifies Prince Tutankhamun as the smaller figure in a fragmentary painting from the king's house in the central city. However, a key iconographic detail contradicts this interpretation. The feet of the smaller figure, drawn as if viewed from the inside and lacking visible toes on the nearer foot, follow a stylistic convention from earlier periods. During the Amarna era, royal family members were consistently depicted with toes shown on the nearer foot. This distinction is clearly observable in other fragments from the same painting. Now, in the Ashmolean Museum, which portray the king, queen, and princesses, since the figure lacks this typical Amarna stylistic feature, it more likely represents a court official or attendant rather than Prince Tutankhamun himself. The roles of wet nurses and tutors to royal children were undoubtedly significant throughout Egyptian history. In the 18th dynasty, individuals in these positions became particularly prominent in the historical record. Among them, Senemit stands out as the most well-known royal tutor of the New Kingdom. Multiple statues portray him with his pupil Nefertiti, the daughter of Queen Hatshepsut. Other tutors are shown alongside their royal charges in the decoration of their own tombs, while wet nurses appear in the tombs of their husbands or sons. The identity of Nefertiti's wet nurse is also clearly established. She was Ti, the wife of I, who would later succeed Tutankhamun. In the tomb she shared with her husband at Amarna, Ti is frequently depicted with her title as a nurse included in the accompanying inscriptions. During Akhenaten's reign, royal wet nurses began to be commemorated in official reliefs for the first time. One such example, unearthed by the Egypt Exploration Society at the Great Palace in Amarna, shows part of a scene where a princess is nursing at her wet nurse's breast. Two more reliefs featuring royal wet nurses were found among reused blocks at Hermopolis. One of these can be reconstructed to show a princess placing a special necklace, an emblem of royal favor, on her nurse's neck. In late 1996, a French archaeological mission led by Alain Zivy discovered the tomb of Maya, the wet nurse of Tutankhamun, in the Memphite necropolis of Saqqara. This tomb was carved into a part of the escarpment where the same team had earlier excavated the tomb of the vizier Aparel, also known as Apiria, who had served under both Amenhotep III and Akhenaten. Apiria held the title of tutor to royal children, but his tomb lacks any depictions of him with those he instructed. In contrast, Maha's tomb features a relief in its first chamber, showing her with the king seated on her lap. He is wearing the blue crown, a clear indicator of his royal status. And inscriptions identify him as Tutankhamun. Not Tutankhamun placing the tomb's construction after his coronation and subsequent name change, the artistic style seen deeper in Maha's tomb indicates that some work continued even after Tutankhamun's death. Mark Gaboldi has suggested that the scene showing the king on Maha's lap may have been altered posthumously. Originally, Maya was holding a blossom to the king's nose, but her hand was later recarved to depict a gesture of homage. However, this theory is not entirely convincing. The change might have occurred shortly after the scene was first created, to match the poses of the men shown in the subregisters behind her, all raising one hand in homage. Portraying a nurse squatting with a male child on her lap has also been linked to Maya. This statue was discovered out of its original context during excavations by the Egypt Exploration Society in the Sacred Animal Complex at North Saqqara. The child's feet rest on a small footstool decorated with bound foreign captives. a symbol of royalty, and he wears a pendant featuring a winged scarab, another royal emblem. Much of the inscription on the base was damaged when the statue was modified to fit a second base, likely during the late period before being placed in the complex. While neither the names of the child nor the nurse survive, her title is still legible. She held the rank of Great Wet Nurse of the King of Upper and Lower Egypt, a distinction not found in the inscriptions in Maha's tomb. Although the statue's high craftsmanship, such as its now missing inlaid, suggests the nurse's elevated status, the figure cannot be definitively identified as Maya. Additionally, the child's facial features do not resemble known depictions of Tutankhamun, and some stylistic details, like the rosettes on the nurse's breasts, suggest the statue may date from before the Amarna period. Zevi emphasized the significance of Maya possessing a tomb of her own, particularly one larger than that of Vizier, Apiria. If Tutankhamun's mother had died while he was still an infant, Maya likely played a significant role in his upbringing, which could explain her elevated social standing once he became king. Another figure, speculated by Egyptologists to have influenced Prince Tutankhamun's early life, was a man whose titles included overseer of tutors. Like Maya, he is known solely from his tomb. Discovered and documented in 1990 at Akhmim by a team from the Australian Centre for Egyptology, Macquarie University, under the leadership of Boyo Okiminga. The intact cartouches of King Tutankhamun, featured in the tomb's decoration, clearly indicate it was created during his reign. On the tomb's facade, a chariot scene depicts the king holding the reins with another figure riding alongside him, possibly highlighting a close association or mentoring relationship. Okinga observes that it is highly unusual to find anyone, besides the queen depicted riding in the royal chariot alongside the king, while ancient texts confirm that a charioteer typically accompanied the pharaoh during military or hunting excursions. Artistic convention usually maintained the image of the king riding a Lanan emblem of majestic solitude. A rare exception may be found in a small limestone fragment from Amarna, now housed in the Brooklyn Museum. James F. Romano wrote extensively about this piece, suggesting that the rounded shape in front of a young archer identified by him as Prince Tutankhamun might represent a driver hunched over the chariot. This interpretation seems likely, given the absence of reins tied around the archer's waist, which are usually present in similar scenes. Romano also posited that if the youth's headband once included a uraeus, this would designate him as a king rather than a prince. Since the uraeus was reserved for royalty, specifically the king and queen during Akhenaten's reign, the scene itself is quite small, with the entire figure measuring about 5 centimeters tall, suggesting it may have once adorned a stela commissioned by a private individual rather than gracing the wall of a temple or palace. Other stelae from Amarna feature deities instead of royalty, adding further uncertainty to the figure's identity. It remains an open question whether the archer is indeed King Tutankhaten, Amen, or possibly a deity such as Shed, who appears in 2 other stelae from the same site in the tomb facade at Akhmim. A man is shown sharing the royal chariot with the king not as a driver, but as a fan-bearer. While the king's cartouches are only partially intact, the fan-bearer's name is entirely absent. Most scholars identify the king as Tutankhamun. Okinga argues that the man accompanying him is likely not the tomb's owner, but rather the husband of Nefertiti's wet nurse, like Queen Tai, Akhenaten's mother. I was from Akhmim, and his connection to the city is confirmed by a temple he later commissioned after becoming pharaoh. Okinga suggests it is quite plausible that the tomb owner and were relatives, even if their precise relationship cannot be definitively established. As noted earlier, Mark Gayboldy supports the idea that the royal family was closely linked to a clan from Akhmim. Regardless of this theory, there is no conclusive evidence that Prince Tutankhamun spent any part of his childhood in or near Akhmim. The period following Akhenaten's death remains a subject of intense scholarly debate. Today, most experts agree that a woman briefly held the throne between Akhenaten's demise and Tutankhamun's rise to power. Research by Mark Gayboldy has revealed that she adopted the throne name Ankheteper, beloved of Wendra equals Akhenaten, and referred to herself as Neferneferwetten, beneficial for her husband. However, the identity of this woman and her husband is still unresolved. In 2009, Aidan Dodson put forward a new theory replacing his earlier views. He proposed that the woman in question was Nefertiti, who served as her husband's co-regent. After the death of his first male co-regent, Smenkhare, upon Akhenaten's own death, she would have acted as regent for their son. Tutankhaten. Other Egyptologists contend that this female ruler was Meritaten Akhenaten's eldest daughter and possibly also his wife or the sister-wife of Smenkhare. James Allen, for instance, favors another daughter, Nefertiti Jr., the fourth-born, who he believes was married to Smenkhare and later succeeded by Tutankhaten. To add to the complexity, some scholars, including the present author and certain experts in Hittite history, believe the queen who ruled just before Tutankhaten was the same widow mentioned in later Hittite sources. According to these texts, she wrote to King Shupalululiuma, asking him to send one of his sons to Egypt to become her husband and co-ruler. There is disagreement over the widow's identity, whether she was Nefertiti or Merititonas. Well, as over the fate of the Hittite prince, some believe he was murdered en route or shortly after arriving in Egypt. Another group of scholars identifies this widow as Anquisanemen and places the entire episode about a decade later, after Tutankhamun's death. It's important to recognize that none of these theories about the succession before Tutankhaten or after Tutankhamun's death can be fully reconciled with the current body of evidence. With compelling arguments on all sides, the debate remains unresolved, and a comprehensive review of every position would be of limited use here. There is no direct evidence indicating that Tutankhaten was crowned at Thebes, despite later claims by his second successor, Horemheb, who stated he had been crowned there about 15 years after. Furthermore, no other specific location has been clearly identified as the site of the young prince's coronation. Egyptian texts generally reference a new king's appearance on the throne without always specifying the exact location of the ceremony. Visual representations of coronations, whether from earlier or later periods, typically show deities presiding over the event. Flanking the newly enthroned king who wears the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, it is presumed that during this ritual, the pharaoh received the crook and flail, long-standing symbols of royal authority. Dating back to the Old Kingdom, among the artifacts found in Tutankhamun's tomb are a child-sized flail and crook one of each. The crook's caps display the king's throne name, Nebkheper, accompanied by rearing cobras, while the flail's base is inscribed with both his personal name, Tutankhaten, and his throne name. These similarities in scale, materials, and craftsmanship suggest that the two items were originally a matched set, possibly crafted for the young king's accession ceremony. In 2001, Nozomu Kawai identified the upper fragment of a limestone stela housed in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo that appears to reference a royal accession. On the left side, beneath a winged sun disk, Isis is shown nursing a smaller-sized king in the presence of a ithyphallic form of Amen, labeled as Minamanari. A patch of lettuce, a symbol commonly associated with the god Min, is also visible. Behind him, with Mut offering him notched palm, ribs an emblem of eternal reign. The elaborate Hemham crown worn by the king on the stela also appears in depictions of Tutankhamun. In reliefs at Luxor Temple and on the backrest of his golden throne, although the stela's surface is heavily damaged and the cartouches identifying the king are illegible, the style of the relief suggests it dates from the post-Amarna era. Kawai believes the traces beneath the winged sun disk represent the throne name Nebkheper, associated with Tutankhaten. Amen. The lower half of the stela is missing, along with the inscription identifying the commissioner, who may have been depicted on it as well. Acquired in Luxor over 125 years ago, the piece may have originated from Karnak, but other possibilities include Min's sanctuary in Akhmim or Koptos, both associated with the god. The first duty of a new pharaoh was to ensure the proper burial of their predecessor, including all necessary rites. Given Tutankhaten's young age, it is likely that others handled these responsibilities on his behalf. Interestingly, all known funerary objects originally intended for the ruling queen were discovered in Tutankhamun's tomb, with her name later replaced by his, implying she may not have received a burial appropriate for a pharaoh. Seal impressions. bearing the throne name Nebkepper were found in KV 55, a tomb in the Valley of the Kings that held the remains of a man identified by some scholars as Tutankhaten's father. This connection suggests Tutankhamun may have had at least a formal role in that burial. However, the exact meaning of these seal impressions is debated. For instance, some scholars propose the remains belonged to Akhenaten's co-regent, Smenkhkare, and that he was originally buried at Tel El. The seals may then signify the transfer of his body and burial items to the Valley of the Kings, possibly soon after Tutankhamun adopted the name change from Aton to Amun. Since the seals display only the throne name and not the personal name, it is difficult to determine the exact point in Tutankhaten's reign when this activity took place. Given that one or more of Tutankhaten's predecessors had funerary temples in Thebes, it is plausible that their original burial was planned for the Valley of the Kings rather than the royal wadi at Amun. Therefore, Nefertitimists accept the theory that the man ultimately buried in KV 55 was initially laid to rest elsewhere and later reinterred there during Tutankhaten's reign. This theory currently offers the most coherent explanation for the presence of the seal impressions bearing his throne name. Even if the identity of his predecessor remains uncertain, there is strong evidence that a restoration of traditional practices had already begun when Tutankhaten ascended the throne. The queen's funerary items and the construction of a temple by one of Akhenaten's successors at Thebes suggest that customary beliefs surrounding death and burial had regained official favor, and that the worship of Amun had resumed. Akhenaten's newly founded capital in Middle Egypt was not only the central residence of the royal family, but also temporarily replaced Thebes as the religious hub in the south. Memphis, which also housed a temple dedicated to Aten under Akhenaten's regime, maintained its importance as an administrative center throughout the Amarna period, though some scholars have continued to associate the fourth year of Tutankhamun's reign with the abandonment of Tel El Amarna. Archaeological evidence shows that the city remained inhabited, though no longer by the royal court until the reign of Horemheb. Recent studies have increasingly suggested that the royal departure from Amarna occurred at the very beginning of Tutankhaten's rule. Like Gaboldi, I now find it likely that Tutankhaten never ruled from Amarna at all. Interestingly, there is some indication that uncertainty surrounded the permanence of this move. Excavations conducted before World War II by the Egypt Exploration Society uncovered deliberately sealed doorways in both official and private buildings, possibly in anticipation of a future REOCCU PATION. So far, most of the small artifacts unearthed at Tel El Amarna that can be linked to Tutankhamun primarily, faience ring bezels and the molds used to make them display his throne name, Nebkepper, rather than his personal name. Only a few items bear his birth name, and these refer to him as Tutankhamun. To date, no object bearing the name Tutankhaten has been discovered at Amarna. The only artifact with a cartouche naming Tutankhaten not recovered from KV 62, his tomb. In western Thebes is a portion of a small limestone stela. This piece was donated to the Egyptian Museum in Berlin by Ludwig Burchard and Friedrich Wilhelm von Bissing in the late 19th century. Only the left half of the lunette, which depicts the gods Amun and Mut, survived World War II. Their presence suggests a Theban origin for the stela, given Amun's central role in the cult there, though its exact provenance remains unknown. The king, named as Nebkepper Tutankhaten, is depicted wearing a long pleated robe tied with a sash and the blue crown with flowing streamers. He is shown presenting floral offerings to the enthroned deities Amun-Re, king of the gods, and Mut, lady of heaven, mistress of the gods. When Adolf Erman first published the piece in the early 20th century, he identified the style as characteristic of the Amarna period. He remarked that the artist seemed unfamiliar with traditional conventions for portraying deities, rendering them with unexpectedly cheerful expressions. However, the apparent lack of solemnity is likely due to the sculptor's limited skill, rather than intentional artistic choices. A notable detail Mut's headdress further suggests the artist's unfamiliarity with standard iconography. She wears a modius topped with twin falcon plumes, a type of crown more commonly associated with queens than goddesses, especially during the Amarna era. In later periods, and seemingly prior to Akhenaten's reign as well, Mut is shown with a double crown atop a vulture headdress. Among the most important objects created and inscribed during the early part of the king's reign, when he was still called Tutankhamun to thrones. Both were placed in his tomb and have survived into modern times, along with other items he used in life. One of these, the inlaid ebony throne object, No. 351, was nicknamed the ecclesiastical throne by Howard Carter, who thought it resembled the bishop's chairs he knew from European cathedrals. The label persisted, though there is no evidence the throne served any religious function for the king, in contrast to the well-known gold throne object No. 91, whose backrest features an often reproduced scene of the royal couple. The ebony throne has received far less attention or appreciation. Despite being beautifully crafted in line with traditional Egyptian artistic standards, its structure consists of a curved and slanted backrest supported by two vertical stiles and a central braccia, furniture from the Middle Kingdom. The seat mimics a folding stool, a design not exclusive to royalty. Depictions of officials seated on such stools appear from the reign of Amenhotep III and continue through the Ramesside era. Several features, such as the goosehead legs and the imitation cowhide draped over the seatwood, have been accessible to non-royal individuals as well. However, the king's status is clearly indicated by decorative motifs such as the aro of cobras wearing sun discs across the top rail and the vulture with spread wings beneath it. The backrest features a decorative architectural motif of alternating ebony and ivory niches, with no human figures included. This omission may explain the absence of the radiant sun disk, the symbol Akhenaten introduced to represent the god Aten, which is prominently displayed above the royal couple on the gold throne's backrest. On the ebony throne, a simplified disc in the center of the headrail is identified as Aten by two small cartouches enclosing the god's didactic name, rendered in the form introduced by Akhenaten during the later years of his reign. On the reverse side of the backrest, the king's name is consistently given as Tutankhamun. This name also appears on the front end, the cartouches topped with sun discs beneath the headrail, and in the inscriptions along the vertical ivory inlays. However, on the two horizontal ebony inlays, he is referred to as the perfect god, Nebkheper Tutankhamun. Observing this inconsistency in names, Howard Carter concluded that the young king's return to the traditional Theban religion was a gradual process, not an abrupt change. Later research proposed that the horizontal ebony strips were replacements for earlier ones originally inscribed with the name Tutankhaten. One of the key features that helps date the inlaid ebony throne earlier than the gold throne is the use of the title perfect ruler at the beginning of inscriptions found on 3 of the vertical ebony strips. This title, introduced by Akhenaten to replace the conventional perfect god, indicates that it remained in limited use after Tutankhaten's ascension to the throne. By the time the gold throne was made, however, the choice had been made to return to the traditional title, Perfect God. This older title appears in the inscriptions on the gold throne's backrest, which still names the king as Tutankhaten, as well as in the updated cartouches on the added ebony strips of the inlaid throne. The gold throne has been the subject of extensive analysis and has been widely published in books on ancient Egypt, the Amarna period, and Tutankhamun himself. In their original publication, Carter and Mace noted the coexistence of both versions of the king's name. Tutankhaten is found on the stiles and the center support of the backrest, as well as in the inlaid cartouche on the outer side of the right armrest. Meanwhile, Tutankhamun appears in gold foil cartouches, created using the chasing technique on the inside of the left armrest, and in the inscriptions identifying the inlaid ebony throne. These mixed cartouches reflect the political and religious shifts that marked the king's reign. By the mid-1970s, Egyptologists began re-examining the gold throne with growing skepticism about whether it had originally been made for Tutankhaten. Alterations in the decoration and clear modifications to the cartouches suggested it may have been initially intended for a different ruler. In addition, the throne's dimensions imply it was not designed for a child. Its seat height approximately 52 centimeters, equivalent to 1 ancient Egyptian cubit, makes it the tallest chair surviving from pharaonic Egypt. Still, the throne's size and lavish decoration more likely reflect the symbolic prestige of its owner, rather than his physical stature. After all, who could have predicted at the time of Tutankhamun's accession how long he would actually reign or continue using such a throne?